This is an ODB Films production. Visit odbfilms.com today.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This show is all about growing in our understanding and practice of faith. Past episodes are available wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm Doug Tuke, the Director of Ministry at ODB Films, and today we're going to look at the Index of Banned Books. God bless the Catholic Church telling you what to read. Now, what's fun about this show is that the modern thinker is going to be like, I can't believe this ever happened. And the historical thinker is going to be like, well, actually, there's quite a few list of banned books and da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so let's unpack what all that means. Yes, there was a time when the church was like, yeah, don't read that ever. And there was a time when the church said, yeah, it's okay to read that now, I guess. Okay. And it's true that the Bible was actually on the list of banned books. So this is going to be a great show. I can't wait for us to just totally dig in. So here's where we want to go. 50 years ago, Pope Paul VI, he abandoned it. The notorious Index of Prohibited Books. Actually, what he did was he issued a notification that it, quote, no longer had the force of ecclesiastical positive law with the associated penalties. Here's what it was. It was established, this index, the list, was established to warn believers against books that could harm their faith or their morals. So Catholics were forbidden to read books without permission, under pain of mortal sin. All right? 20 different versions of the index were promulgated. The first was in 1559, and then the last one was in 1948. 1948, and they included works of science, philosophy, and mathematics, as well as fiction, and certain translations of the scriptures that were considered unreliable. So a good many of the books that appeared on the index are now totally considered foundational scholarly works and are actually taught in Catholic schools. Now, before we go any further, here's what I want to do. We need to spend just a little bit of time kind of digging into censorship and Christianity, okay? There's kind of a rough bit of history here before we can really kind of place the index into its context. So probably the most famous case of censorship ever was Socrates, okay? He was sentenced to drink poison in 399 BC for corrupting young people with his acknowledgement of unorthodox divinities. Okay, but it's fair to assume that Socrates was not the first person to actually be punished for violating any kind of moral or political code of his time. So the ancient view of censorship as like the state doing something good, like a benevolent task in the best interest of the public, it's still upheld in a lot of countries. For example, China. We're actually going to do a show on the Chinese Catholic Church, and we'll talk about that. This was advocated by the rulers of the Soviet Union, who were responsible for really the longest lasting and the most extensive censorship era of the 20th century. So the struggle for freedom of expression, it's as ancient as the history of censorship. Euripides in the year 480 BC, he lived 480 to 406 BC. He defended the true liberty of freeborn men, the right to speak freely. Okay, but nevertheless, he was careful to point out that free speak was a choice because he knew that it had penalties. Okay, so let's dig in. Free speech. This implies the idea of free expression of thoughts. It was challenged by pre-Christian rulers. It was no less troubling to the people who were really guarding Christianity as it was coming of age, even more so as really orthodoxy became established, or right teaching, okay? So to fend off heresies or heretical thinking to Christian doctrine, church leaders introduced a lot of measures such as the Nicene Creed, okay, which was promulgated in 325. So this profession of faith, obviously widely used in the Catholic liturgy today. And as more books were written and copied, even more widely disseminated ideas perceived as like subversive or heretical were spread beyond the control of the rulers. So consequently, censorship became way more rigid and the punishment way more severe. So here comes the big shift, okay? The invention of the printing press in Europe, mid-15th century, only increased what was considered this need for censorship. Now, although printing greatly aided the Catholic Church in its mission, it also aided the Protestant Reformation and quote-unquote heretics, we'll be careful there, such as Martin Luther. So the printed book became a religious battleground, this sort of like neo-orthodoxy, the protection of what was considered right teaching. And this is when the Index Librorum Prohibitorum 1564 was promulgated. Okay, this is when it was really brought forth. So in Western history, the very term censorship takes on like a whole new meaning with the introduction of the index. Now, I'd mentioned Paul VI, he ordered the first index. Pope Paul IV ordered the first index of prohibited books in 1559. And the index was issued again 20 times by different popes. So the last index we mentioned before was issued as recently as 1948, and then finally basically abolished in 1966. Thank you, Pope Paul VI. So these lists of books banned for heretical or ideologically dangerous content were issued by the Roman Catholic Church. Zealous guardians carried out the sacred Inquisition, banning and burning books, and sometimes also the authors. Gross. We'll get into that in a minute. But the most famous of the authors that the Catholic Church banned is undoubtedly Galileo, who we talked about in a show. We talked about how his writings got chucked on the index list because of a small group of people who found certain lines of teaching to be unorthodox. And the most famous victims of the Inquisition's trials have got to be Joan of Arc and probably St. Thomas More. Okay, so the banning, censorship, it's in our church history. It's just good to talk about it. Okay, the Spanish authorities, they were not only worried about the religious situation in Europe, but also in America and the possibility that America could be invaded with ideas from other countries. Protestant countries was considered a permanent threat. There was so the church was, as America was really developing, there was a sense of like heresy creeping into what they wanted to be Spanish settled Catholicism. Now, that's not even the worst of it. There's a historian, Pedro Gubevich Perez, and he talks about the Lima Inquisition and book censorship. And this is a big deal in church censorship. So the Catholic Church controlled all these universities like the famous Sorbonne, and they also controlled publications. So the church decreed in 1543 that no book could be printed or sold without permission of the church. And then in 1563, Charles IX of France decreed that nothing could be printed without the special permission of the king. So soon, these other secular rulers of Europe followed suit. So consequently, European rulers used systems of governmental license, to print and publish to control scientific and artistic expressions that they perceived basically threatened the moral and the political order of society. So there's like this dual system of censorship that was created through these close alliances between church and state in Catholic countries. And it was also exported to colonized territories in the Americas, So Philip II of Spain reinstated the Inquisition in 1569. We did a show on the Inquisition. If you're kind of vague on the details of the Inquisition, check out that past episode of Renovo. It'll really help clarify some things. Okay, so he reinstates the Inquisition in 1569 and established the Peruvian Inquisition in 1570 as part of a colonial policy designed to deal with the political and also the ideological crisis that's happening in Peruvian government, or what was then a vice royalty. This is a big deal for the church. So the Peruvian Inquisition system was a total Spanish blueprint for controlling the import of books. The Inquisition officers periodically examined ships and luggage in all these ports and inspected libraries, bookstores, and printing houses. That's how serious it was. When the Inquisition was established in Peru in 1570, the tribunals, a tribunal, by the way, that's the canon law authority in a local diocese, The tribunal's district ranged from Panama to Chile and Rio de la Plata. That's a big area to manage. And they were checking boats for the written word. Unbelievable, right? So without a doubt, the Inquisition's censorship in the colonies in the Americas was super oppressive, and it was very sinister, but it could hardly compare to the Spanish invaders' destruction of all the unique literature of like the Mayan people. My gosh, right? The burning of the Maya codices in the 16th century remains one of the worst criminal acts committed against a people and their cultural heritage. A terrible loss, to the world heritage of literature and language. We marvel at Mayan culture, and we had the text to understand it, and they burnt it. And that's how gross, that's just how awful it was, okay? When Pope Paul VI made the index into a guide in the 60s rather than a prohibitive law, the titles on it were not suddenly declared like blameless or worthy of reading, just so you know. The church simply told the laity that it was now their responsibility to figure out which book they should and should not read. So Paul VI said that the index, quote, remains morally binding in light of the demands of natural law, insofar as it admonishes the conscience of Christians to be on guard for those writings that can endanger faith and morals. Okay, a few things. We're going to talk about the index in detail when we come back.
ODB Films is a non-profit Catholic ministry dedicated to artfully made, spiritually rich films. We invite you to visit odbfilms.com and preview over 200 of our short films designed to complement your ministry needs. Also, be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter for previews of upcoming content and access to sneak peeks of future projects. Visit odbfilms.com today.
Okay, the Divine Mercy Diaries of Sister Faustina were actually at one point placed on the index, at least in part, because they were some unreliable translations circulating of them, but they were later taken off. Isn't that unbelievable? So Catholic authors were basically, they were given a chance when their books were considered for the index to correct, to edit, or to defend their works if they didn't want their books to be on the list. That's a really, really big deal. So the church was not the only entity to maintain a list of forbidden books. There were a lot of other lists or people kind of controlling the readership within their country. In France, it was French officials who decided what books were banned, and then the church's index was actually not recognized. Spain had its own index, which we kind of talked about, which sometimes jibed with the church, but a lot of times it didn't. It mostly corresponded with the churches, but it also included a list of books that were allowed once the forbidden part, sometimes like a single sentence, was removed or expurgated, okay? In the Holy Roman Empire, book censorship, which preceded publication of the actual index from the church, came under control of the Jesuits at the end of the 16th century, but had very little effect since the German princes with the empire set up, they had their own system, basically. So you got to remember, I mean, this is hard to do in the 21st century is to look back on this experience. So like retroactive outrage over the index it's similar to when like modern progressives are shocked at the brutality of the Israelites in the Old Testament, as if the Babylonians or the Assyrians were totally tolerant and peaceable. And it was only those awful 10 Commandment types who got hung up on sex and religion and war. That's not fair. It doesn't work. But when we hear the word censorship, especially us Americans, it really bothers us. And so we need to kind of unpack that. We need to maintain this idea that there might have been some spiritual motivation here. Now, I'm not defending an index. What I'm saying is we got to place ourselves into the historical context. So keeping an index of forbidden books was a terrible idea, but it wasn't as shocking to the people at the time as it sounds to us, okay? We love to kind of guffaw and laugh at the cowering sheep of the church. They're so oppressed and fearful that they would let their intellectuals be hobbled with such brutal censorship. That's not very fair. You got to imagine letting someone tell you what you can and cannot read. Imagine being so fearful of words on the page that you'd refuse to even lift the cover for fear that what was written inside could taint or warp your moral standards and your intellect, okay? Imagine being too prejudiced and intellectually blinded to read Huckleberry Finn, Heart of Darkness, or even something, there's one on there called I Dared to Call Him Father, okay? Imagine passionately arguing that an entire class of writers should be rejected. No, that would never happen. That's what we think nowadays. We're open-minded. We're not afraid of books anymore. Okay. The index was a bad thing. And it's much more in keeping with a developed understanding of conscience for the faithful to make their own decisions about what to read. But at the same time, it would be a very good thing if the faithful had a clearer understanding that they do have a duty to make careful decisions about what to read. And most of all, it's ridiculous to scoff at the church for censorship and then to blindly and passionately follow Snapchat or John Oliver or Reddit or BuzzFeed or Samantha Bee as your magisterial authority on what is and is not acceptable reading. There's so much like garbage in, garbage out in the way that we digest information. I want to believe that the informed conscience is built to navigate that. I want to believe that. When you're talking about the time of the index and really even the position of the church for so many centuries, a very, very illiterate population of people, that if something was placed in text, was printed, it carried with it a tremendous credibility. Oh, that was published. In fact, this isn't even that foreign of an idea. Up until recently, being published was a statement of absolute credibility of intellectual properties, of ideas. We didn't just self-publish books, and publishers had reputations. A great publisher maintained great books for the masses. That was a profound idea when it was developed. Again, I am not defending the idea of censorship here, but I am saying that there used to carry with it a sense of valued intellectual character. This goes back to really our understanding, believers, of freedom specifically, okay? If we think, oh, it's better to just have access to absolutely everything and do whatever we want, that's freedom, that's a really poor understanding. And I've talked about this before on the show, but it's worth repeating. Bishop Robert Barron, one of my favorites, he has just a phenomenal definition for the word freedom. He says, freedom is the disciplining of desire so as to make the achieving of the good possible and then effortless. Isn't that a great definition? So what he means is we discipline ourselves in practice and that we become more free in the midst of that. Here's what that means. I can't speak Spanish. I don't know Spanish very well. Somebody who speaks Spanish has a lot of freedom with the Spanish language. Okay, I'm going to have a lot more freedom in good theology if I read good theology. If I read a lot of bad theology, my faith formation is going to suck. I'm not going to understand concepts and ideas. So it's fine. Go out there, print whatever you want, blog away. But for us as believers to equate the value of a blog from some opinionated person who has a broken ecclesiology, who is arguing against doctrine and dogma in the church, and for us to carry that in the same weight as a brilliant academic thinker with credibility within leadership and a cutting intellect, to think that they're the same thing just because they're out there, that is a mistake. That is incorrect. This is one of the great challenges of democracy, is that all of us vote. Rock on. I'm all about the vote. Let's vote. So I have my highly, highly informed, brilliant person over here who's really researched and studied all the issues, laying down their vote. And I have Joe person over here who knows nothing but really likes a certain color, so they vote for that color. And those two votes now have canceled themselves out. Now, I don't have a solution here, but when it comes to us as believers growing in our discipleship, we need to discipline our desires so as to make the achieving of the good possible and then effortless. And we'll find true freedom in that. If somebody writes garbage, don't read it. Don't give them the credit for their garbage. Steep yourself in truth and grow in formation. I'm so glad the index of banned books is gone. I don't think that the church needs to regulate. We need to regulate because we need to push ourselves. There's a reason why wisdom, understanding, and knowledge are gifts of the Holy Spirit. Let's invite those and let's blanket that which we consume from media with those gifts. I promise it will make us better people. Thanks for listening. Sincerely. We're partners in the journey of faith. I hope you will share the Renovo podcast with friends and foes. Send your topic suggestions, questions, and or comments to doug@odbfilms.com. Friends, always remember to engage the tradition and live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.